Good morning and welcome to the 6th meeting in 2014 of the Health and Sports Committee. As usual, I would ask everyone in the room to switch off mobile phones and Blackberries that don't need to be in use, and I would ask people to take note that there are members and officials who are using tablet devices, and this is instead of the hard copies of their papers. I have apologies from Colin Kerr this morning, who's unable to attend, and I welcome back Dennis Robertson as the SNP substitute. Our first item on the agenda today is to return to our work on access to new medicines. As everyone will be aware, following the Routledge and Swainson reviews and the committee's report, the Cabinet Secretary asked the SMC to review its processes, which it has now done, and we'll hear from the SMC later this morning. But first we have a round table with the patients' organisations and indeed a few clinicians here to get your view, your verdict on the work that's done, and some discussion about what needs to be done. As usual, with a round table, I think it is useful for, and saves me all of that, introducing everyone, that we ask our round table to introduce ourselves, and could I ask you, Ian, to start?
My name is Ian Mackersie. I'm a trustee and secretary of aHUSUK, which is a charity and support group for people with an ultra-orphan disease called atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Joan Fletcher, Pompe Family Support Practitioner for the AGSD, which is a charity supporting patients with blood and storage disease.
My name is Myles Fitt. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Manager for Breakthrough Breast Cancer in Scotland.
Gil Patterson, MSP for Clydebank Mulgai.
Frances Macdonald, representing Pharmaceutical Industry, and I sit on the SMC as such.
Emlyn Samuel, Policy Manager from Cancer Research UK.
Good morning, Dennis Robertson, MSP for Aberdeenshire West, substituting for Colin Kerr.
Good morning, Cara McNee, Kidney Cancer Scotland, Communities Development.
Richard Simpson, MSP Mid Scotland and Fife.
Eric Lowe, Chief Executive, Myeloma UK.
Leigh Smith, good morning. Leigh Smith from Melanoma Action and Support Scotland.
Rhoda Grant, MSP for the Highlands and Islands.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Walters. I'm a consultant physician from the Western Infirmary in Glasgow, and I'm here representing the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of that city.
Aileen MacLeod, MSP for the South of Scotland.
Alastair Kent, Chair of Rare Disease UK.
Milne, MSP for North East Scotland.
I'm Lesley Loeliger. I'm the founder and chair of the charity PNH Scotland and also an executive member of the PNH Alliance.
Richard Lyle, MSP Central Region.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Duncan McNeil, and I am the MSP for Greenock and Inverclyde and the convener of the Health and Sport Committee. Gil Patterson, I think you're going to kick us off, Gil, please.
Yeah, if I could just ask a general question that can involve as possible. And, well, I've just said as many, but I would ask it, first of all, to the folk that participated in the TNF group. And I was, wanting to know just how well the group functioned and if you were able to participate and if there was any problems or issues that arose that you found difficult.
If I can start in response to that, I was a member of the SMC's Task and Finish group, although I was unable to attend the final meeting. But I think it was a very careful and a very thorough exercise, and I suspect that all stakeholders, I know I certainly felt able to contribute to the workings and to the discussion, and I think it was a very fair process. There was no impression given that I felt that the agenda and the outcome had been predetermined. I think it was an open and a transparent process, and it reached some very sensible conclusions.
I would second what Alastair says there, and I think In terms of the charitable side, I also I sit on the Scottish Cancer Coalition, and I linked in with the Scottish Cancer Coalition with an update on what was going on, and indeed checking in with the patient involvement side of it, the PACE element of it, and there was certainly broad consensus coming back from the Scottish Cancer Coalition that it was going in the right direction. I fed that back into the group, and we've had further correspondence on how that group is going to be established and set up and what input the coalition can have into that. So we're broadly happy with how it went, and from a patient and from a charity side it was satisfactory.
Yes, Dr. Macdonald.
From the pharmaceutical side, I would back what's been said already. I think it was run in a very open manner. Everybody had a chance to say what they wanted. From our side, we had 3 participants, myself and 2 economists from member companies, and I also had enough time to go back to, without unduly disclosing the discussion, to get input from a wider range of companies so that we could basically put forward the views of a wider group. So I think it was run very well, very fairly.
No one else?
Well, maybe I could ask of those who are here that weren't participants up front, were they consulted in any way? Was there a way in for you to this deliberation that was taking place?
Can I answer that again and say it through for the charity side? I'll repeat what I said a minute ago. I acted as a link to the Scottish Cancer Coalition, so they had an input through myself. They didn't have a direct input, but they were appraised of what was going on, and they were able to feed in views to me. And as I say, it was broadly positive.
Right, good. So it sounds as if it was fairly wide. I'm getting the feeling that it was a satisfactory way of operating, and it went wider than the actual group it was set up. And is that about right?
No complaints about the process?
No.
Did they come to the right conclusions?
Lesley, I would say that, from a petitioner's point of view and from a patient point of view, the report is remarkable in the speed with which it's been compiled, and the very fact that our thoughts and concerns were actually listened to and included is quite remarkable. Obviously, there are some fine details that we need to go over and some extra information that we need to look at, but it has been a remarkable experience for us as petitioners. If we can clarify some of the points that are in there, then I think that we're going to have a world-leading system in Scotland for drug appraisal. So we, as petitioners and patients, are very grateful.
Yes, Professor Walters and I think Alastair Kent.
I think the clinicians' views in Scotland are enormously well aligned with those just articulated by Lesley. From the practitioner's perspective, it's important to have a system that is robust and equitable and that delivers the treatment to the patients in a timely fashion. I think that's a crucial thing. That's something that we all feel as clinicians, that the pressure of time, particularly in the context of some of the conditions that this review particularly deals with. And my personal view is that the team who prepared this report, the entire group, should be commended on the speed with which they've conducted it and the quality which they've achieved in doing so.
Mr. Kent.
Yes, I don't want to really rain on everybody's parade at the moment, but I think on paper the framework is great, and I endorse everything that's been said. But of course, it's how it works in practice that will make the difference to whether or not patients are able to access innovative medicines. And I think, I'm very confident that it will deliver, but I think we need to make sure that we keep a watching brief on the actual working of the process to ensure that it lives up to the expectations that have been built up around it.
I'll take Eric Lowe first, Richard, and
I just want to follow up on Alastair's point, just to emphasise how important that is. The devil is always in the detail. I think that the report is commendable. I think the SMC and the committee have done a fantastic job, but it's all for nothing unless we discuss the detail and implement it and monitor it properly. And I think what's critically important is the SMC get the resources to be able to do this. And I think it's been a major issue for the SMC over many, many years that they just haven't had the resources to do the right job by patients. So I just really hope that the Scottish Government can resource the SMC to the level that they need to deliver this world-class way to approve new drugs in Scotland.
Richard?
I wonder if the last two speakers, and indeed any of the other guests, have specific concerns about the three different areas, end of life, orphan or ultra-orphan. I mean, we're treating them all as one, as it were, but is there any, have you got particular concerns about the implementation of one or other of these three groups?
Mr. Kent, yep.
No, I mean, our principal concern is the rare, the ultra orphans, and as I say, the framework that has been created, I think, looks really excellent. But it's only by seeing how, when innovative therapies start going through the process, and you can see in practice how that is worked, and the sort of evidence that is given weight, and how those submissions can be supported, particularly when you are looking at interventions for ultra-orphan drugs where there are a tiny number of patients in Scotland, or indeed across the whole of the UK, and the ability of patients and patient groups supporting those supporting the submissions to the process will need to be helped in some cases, because obviously making a submission to a process like this is not something that many people have got experience of, particularly if they're also struggling to cope with the impact of a rare condition.
Ian, you haven't been in.
Thank you. I agree that this was the report was an outstanding piece of work, and what impressed us particularly was the political will behind it to make it work and to implement the recommendations, and I'm sure it will have the desired result. To take up Alastair's point, increased opportunities for PIGs to put their views under the new arrangements is welcome, but in our experience, PIGs vary in their capabilities, and some will need significant help, possibly even financial help, to get them to perform, as it were, at the required standard.
Anyone else? See, it's even got to the chase even instead of debate here. I mean, it's because we're all agreed it was an inclusive process. People got their say. I presume from what's been said now that input has been reflected in the language of the initial report, so everybody's happy with that. From the committee's point of view, the objective was, will we get more yeses out of the system? Has everybody agreed that we'll get more yeses out of the system? And when? Because there is an expectation in the first year that, is it 1,500? So everybody believes that will happen. Lesley.
I just have, as we said before, as Alastair mentioned, a few other people mentioned, it's all about the detail, and it's about the specific wording of certain things within the report. From my point of view, you know, I always spoke about the idea of getting the correct specialist to be asked to be included. And within this, obviously with the patient and clinician engagement meeting, that is listed as saying that we would need to include a specialist clinician. I still have the question, who would be classed as a specialist? Because obviously, you know, as a PNH patient, we were reliant entirely on our specialists, our local specialists, believing that they were not actually the expert in our condition. So it's just about the wording to make sure, if we can get the wording so that the correct expert is asked and consulted every single time, then I think it will be an absolutely remarkable change to the system that we've had, and really would completely eliminate any chance of a postcode lottery. So it's just getting that clarification would be great.
Particularly breast cancer, we think the system, again, on paper works well. We think, I mean, the difference between the current system and the new system is pretty much the pace step in the whole process. So there's clearly that we've got to get that right and got to get that set up. It's a new group, we've got to get that established and worked out, and we know there's work getting done on that. We do have to just wait and see what happens, and you know, we think it should work in practice quite well. From a breast cancer perspective, there were 2 medicines that were rejected last year from the SMC on the grounds of cost. They were clinically effective, and we'd like to think that if they were resubmitted under the new system, that they would be approved, and we would watch that with interest to see if that actually happens. So one area we are got an interest in is what happens when you've got a very high cost medicine that comes through the system. It's also hugely clinically effective, and the patient groups also support it, and the clinicians also support it under the new process. Under the current system, probably would stand next to no chance of getting approved. Under the new system, we'd like to think that it has an increased chance of being approved. We accept that the NHS isn't a bottomless pit of money, but if there is a strong will for that medicine to go through, we think it should at least stand a bit more of a chance. So we'd like to see how that works out in practice as well.
Eric Lowe.
I think it's also important, though, that we empower the SMC to continue to do a very robust appraisal of clinical and cost effectiveness, because you know, it's not a case of just saying yes to everything. That's not in the best interest of patients or industry long term. And I think if our goal is just to say yes to everything, there's no point in having the SMC. So I think we need to balance out this desire to say more yeses, but yeses to the right drugs that demonstrate clinical and cost effectiveness. It's the best use of NHS resources, which in the long term is best for patients in Scotland. So I don't think we should dumb down the work of the SMC. We need to empower them to do a very robust and very fair appraisal of these new drugs with additional clinical and patient input to refine some of the uncertainty that you get in some of the drugs that SMC in the past have said no to. But I don't think we should be, you know, saying yes to everything.
I don't think the report said that. The report said that using what they would deem their new system, that wouldn't be a careless system, it would be a robust system, that 1,500 people would benefit. That's not insignificant. You know, I want to be excited about that, but I don't want to be overexcited about that on behalf of people and create an expectation that's not delivered. There are currently people, according to well, we know there are currently people being treated under an old system that's not getting access to this. So from the debate and the announcement in the chamber, there are people being denied medicines. If this new system was in place, they would be receiving those medicines. So it's pretty important. I would have thought it's a pretty important aspect that people are being denied that at this time, and for however long the process takes to arrive at the system that we want to arrive at. You know, so. But you know, as long as they're able to deliver that, I think that's important. But everybody accepts that, you know, that's where we can be, and there's no doubts there. Yeah, Emlyn, Samuel, and then Dr. Macdonald.
So I'll just follow that up and say that Cancer Research UK welcomes the review, and I think the findings are very promising. And as has been said a number of times, that the devil is in the detail, and as well as a robust system, it needs to be consistent as well. And how these changes emerge in the detail and how they are actually structured, and the frameworks has to be consistent to make sure that everything is reviewed in the same way and is made transparent, I would say as well.
Dr. Macdonald.
I don't want to repeat what everybody said, but I would agree. From the industry point of view, we are very pleased with the direction of travel, and we do believe there'll be more yeses. I think the key, as everybody said, is how the PACE group will work. And there are a lot of detailed questions on the table, how the experts will be involved, how does industry contribute, how does the timing work. But I have every confidence that the SMC will continue to work in a collaborative manner in developing those processes, and industry obviously has to understand them in enough time to make submissions following these new guidance as opposed to the previous guidance. But I don't see any sign that it won't change.
Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. I'm just going to ask a very brief question just now, just to get a couple of things on the record, and we'll come back and later for a more substantive question, just in terms of definitions of what an end-of-life condition would be. From my notes here, it says that it will be under normal existing treatments, it would be a life expectancy on average of less than 3 years. Is that balance about right? How does that contrast with how NICE would deem an end-of-life condition to be in England? And secondly, in terms of orphan and ultra-orphan conditions, there's a prevalence level within the report as well to try and define officially, because this committee used to use orphan, ultra-orphan or rare or whatever definitions, but there was no in statute, there was no statutory guidance as to what that meant. So just for going forward, quite technical questions, we'll come back in later maybe with something a bit more substantive, but have we got the balance right in terms of how we would deem end of life? How does that compare with how others would view end of life? And in terms of orphan and ultra orphans, in terms of the definitions, are people content we've got that about right?
Yes.
So I think yes. I think the definitions is broad and helpful. I think it's broader than NICE's definition of end of life. I think it's also important to note that NICE are not going to use end of life criteria moving forward. It will be consumed within burden of illness as part of their value-based assessment strategy moving forward. But I think from the Scottish perspective, I think it's appropriate.
The orphan and ultra-orphan conditions, just for putting on the record, approval or otherwise, just so as the committee takes this forward ourselves, we want to get through this in a structured fashion.
Joan Fletcher.
Yeah. We very much welcome the recognition of ultra-orphan drugs. I mean, and this is one thing that we, the original public petitions were questioning. And as I say, from a point of the view of the AGSD, we very much welcome that. We feel as though the ultra-orphan drugs were very much at a disadvantage in the past because of being able to get that evidence in the small amount of population. So we very much welcome that, and we do agree with the guidelines that...
Yes, Mr. King, to respond to Bob's...
Yes, orphan, of course, is defined through European legislation as having a prevalence of fewer than 5 in 10,000 or 1 in 2,000 in the European Union. But it's the ultra-orphan category which, excuse me, which I think is important to acknowledge, and I agree with Joan that the recognition that those drugs for incredibly rare conditions have fallen through the net previously on too many occasions. So the specific recognition in this proposal is one which is to be welcomed.
Yeah, certainly. Nanette Mellon.
Yes, I really wanted to ask ABPI regarding the PACE system. At that stage, you can put forward patient access schemes or revision of patient access schemes. I wonder what your views are on this, and do you think that the pause that this allows will encourage you to propose a patient access scheme more often?
Obviously, until we see how it all works, it's difficult to definitively answer, but I mean, companies have the option to do that at the beginning, so that they take a view on the value their medicine provides and the extent of need of that medicine when they first submit. And you're right, this gives them a second option to do it. So I think it'll just be a rethinking of what they decided at the beginning. Do they reconsider it? But I think we have to keep the PACE and the patient access scheme processes quite separate, because they are two different things. They might just happen to be occurring in the same period of time. But yes, companies can reconsider their position as taken at the beginning of the submission.
And if there are issues other than price, like data or modelling, will you have the opportunity at this stage to be involved more in the process?
I think that's an open question. The original Health and Sport report and the Scottish Government response did say that companies will have an opportunity to discuss with the SNC at the beginning. And we haven't started that discussion yet because there have been other priorities before working that one out. There's no there's no view at the moment to having that discussion in the middle, but I think all this detail is still to be worked out.
Anyone else? No? Gil Patterson?
Just on that point, Chairman, Convener, I'm grateful for that. As I understand it, if the SMC put a drug on a new application on pause, then it would go to the clinicians and patient interest groups for a recommendation. And then it would then go back to SMC, and then it would perhaps go to the industry to see if a discount would be available. And I wondered what people's thoughts were that, you know, coming from an industrial or a kind of commercial background, that I thought maybe the better process might be that SMC put it in pause, that before it goes to patients and the clinicians expert group, that in fact it would then be the opportunity for the industry to engage. And then it would go with that, whatever outcome that was, then go to the patients and the clinicians, and then back to the SMC. But would that not be a kind of more, would there not be a benefit in that everyone would know exactly where they stood rather than a recommendation coming from patients and clinicians? And, you know, there's still some dubiety about that. You know, I think it might be more wholesome and better for everybody if the intervention was earlier on.
Maybe two thoughts on that.
Have I got it right, or is that I've got my understanding right?
The opportunity for the company to put forward a revised or a new patient access scheme runs in parallel with the PACE meeting. And you were questioning, should it be one after the other, the industry first and then the PACE? I think two comments. One, the industry has that opportunity when they first make the submission, so they know what their cost-effectiveness numbers are. They should have a good idea of what the value of the medicine is from a clinical perspective. So they make their submission, and in many cases they offer a patient access scheme at the beginning. I think once they see a minded no from the NDC, they could probably, in many cases, judge reasonably accurately if that is likely to happen when they first submit. So I think they've already taken that decision at the beginning. They can then revise it if they wish, but I don't think there's any rationale for saying have that discussion and then have the patient have the PACE, because in some ways there's nothing different from the thought process they went through at the very beginning. They can then, for strategic reasons, decide to either put in a patient access scheme or change it, but I don't think there's any rationale to make them one after the other. I think the PACE becomes very valuable because it adds a lot more depth to the extent of clinical need than we get at the moment.
Anyone else? Lesley.
On that point that you were making, there's an excellent flowchart at the end of the report, which I found very helpful. And from a patient perspective, I thought that the PACE was more to do with helping the SMC and the whole appraisal system to work to understand the real cost offsets and the difference that drug could make. You know, for example, from PNH patient point of view, other patients like myself who are on my drug no longer need monthly blood transfusions and can go back to work. Most of the patients have gone back to work and therefore off of benefits. So from my point of view, the PACE was all about education and help for the SMC from the appraisal making process, and I could be wrong in that, and not so much for the drug company who already know those benefits. That was my take on it.
Is Bob, you want back in?
Yeah, I do. This was one of the other points I was hoping to get in later to raise. I think my colleague Gil Patterson makes a very reasonable point, and apologies for speaking in layman's terms of ABPI and pharmaceutical companies do incredibly important jobs, and they submit hopefully based on robust evidence, but they also go in with a maximum price for their business model to get that through an SMC process. I have no doubt there will be a whole range of prices they'll consider putting in their original submission at. And I do think it's reasonable in partnership working that if there is a pause in the process and we're going to patients and clinicians to talk about what added value these drugs have that isn't been reflected by the traditional quality process, in other words, to get more yeses, that this is an appropriate time also for pharmaceutical companies to have a similar discussion with their relevant individuals within the sector to see if they can reconsider their, now we're not allowed to say price, let's call it their reimbursement rate, because we're not allowed to say price apparently. I just think that's a reasonable position to set out as a parliamentary representative who's very proud of the work this committee's done and the government's done. So I'm just wondering, including not just the ABPI, if other people around this table think getting more yeses is not just about talking to clinicians and patients more, but it's also about members of ABPI in partnership seeing what they can do more to get greater yeses, and a pause in the process would be the ideal time to make that happen.
Dr Macdonald and then Leigh Smith.
And I think the process as described does give them that opportunity, because the PACE will run and the company can reconsider patient access scheme, put it in or revise it if there is one already. All I was saying before was I don't think it makes sense to have one and then the other. I think they should be seen as two separate events, and they run in parallel, and you don't want either party sort of playing one against the other. So I think the opportunity is there, but they should run in parallel and separate.
Leigh Smith and then Professor Walters.
I agree completely with Gil Patterson's point and with Mr Doris. I do think that there would be advantage in the drug companies negotiating at the stage before the full PACE is commissioned, because we're talking about the time of clinicians and we can't have everything. We can't have the need for patients to be seen and to be having their treatment in the clinics, and also have clinicians serving on committees elsewhere. So as much as possible, we should try to come to an agreement with the pharmaceutical industry about how much can be afforded to reimburse them for this new product. And if it is possible to bring that in before the clinicians, whose time is very precious, both to patients and to every other thing, it really would be important to try and do that at that point. Thank you.
Professor Walters.
I think that
Mr. Lowe.
The process that's been set out, I think, recognises the value of enriching the dialogue and really allowing a proper holistic appraisal of a new medicine by drawing the views of the clinicians, the patients, and also in allowing that dialogue with industry that I think previously we perhaps hadn't had quite so readily. The temporal sequencing of that dialogue, I think, is perhaps slightly more difficult. Certainly, as a clinician, I take the point of view expressed earlier here that we like to have all of the information on the table in order that we can make a timely decision. From my reading, however, of the report as it stands just now, I think we will have the opportunity to do that with the two processes running in parallel. And I'm not sure if we need necessarily to mandate a temporal sequence of meetings as the process plays out.
Mr. Lowe.
So I think this is a really good discussion that's drilling down to the detail. My own view is that current SMC systems should be exhausted prior to a PACE meeting. So I think there should be the discussion between the SMC and the company around cost effectiveness prior to the PACE meeting. And I think that would give the clinicians and patients the opportunity to discuss the broader benefits and some of the issues and challenges around patient access schemes. I think it's important also to distinguish between the type of patient input and clinician input at the PACE stage versus the actual appraisal stage. Because I think if we're going to make this work and make it world class, we want the actual appraisal system to work better and to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of clinical expert and patient expert input into the process. And we should only think about PACE as being useful as and when things aren't successful with the current system. Otherwise, there's this duplicity in processes. It would need to be very clear what additional input patients and clinicians would give in a PACE environment to the normal appraisal system. So I think this is where the detail needs to be worked out. And I think it would make sense to me that the actual appraisal system should allow for the appropriate level of clinical and patient expert input. If there's a minded no, then that's the opportunity for SMC to sit down with industry and to discuss a solution to address uncertainty and cost effectiveness. And should that fail, it would otherwise be a no, it then defaults to a deeper, more solution-orientated discussion with pace. And I think that, to me, is the most sensible thing to do.
Emlyn,
yeah, I would agree with that, actually. And given the potential extension of time that that process could demonstrate on the process, then I think there needs to be a really clear need for the additional evidence, and that patient and clinical involvement should happen throughout the process and not just at that stage.
Mr. Fitt,
I mean, this issue was debated in the Task and Finish group about where you position the additional pass. I think there's pros and cons to both options, and I take the points on board that others have said on this. To me, the key is that there is a second opportunity, whereas before there was just that one opportunity for the pass. And the second opportunity is very welcome, and it will give an added chance for medicines to get approved, and indeed medicines to come down in cost. I agree with Mr. Doris that says that it shouldn't just be based on the patient and clinicians making the decisions on this. We need to find a way to get the pharma industry to come down in price. But the key for me is the fact there is this additional step, and I'm relaxed about where it is in the system at this stage.
Does that take us to the health board level? Because I think most of us agree that the principle is that there should be a second go at this, but maybe the concern would be that it becomes a default position. Like I'll come to that later about the existing situation, but ITPR, despite correspondence from the chief medical officer, whatever. I'll come back to get some views on the Beats and Clinicians letter to the committee. But is there a concern that becomes a default position, or how do the boards play in here? We've established that there's a political will. We've established that the government's on board. The review in the SMC, things are changing, the potential for change. Are we sure that this was going to follow right through the system, and we're going to get the changes we need at the health boards to be picking up on this, not just picking up on the budget or worrying about the budget that's going to... Dr. Macdonald?
Yes, I think you bring up a key point there with regard to the health boards, because obviously nobody wants a situation where you have more yeses from the SMC and then the health boards find that they have difficulty actually putting that into play. So the funding clearly has to come onto the table. And I think it's worth mentioning the PPRS, because at the moment, if the health boards don't have extra funds, then presumably they're going to have problems either accepting these medicines or finding the funds from elsewhere to pay for these medicines. So the money has to come from somewhere. But it's worth mentioning that the PPRS opportunistically has just been re-signed and started from January this year. And the PPRS is the pharmaceutical pricing system, which is relevant for the whole of the UK. And within that, the government and the industry have agreed that they will fix the branded medicines drug budget for the next 5 years. For the first 2 years, it's fixed at 0% increase, and then just under 2% for the next 2 years. So within that, it basically implies that if the branded medicines budget goes above that baseline set at the end of last year, then industry will pay back those funds. So I think there's an opportunity there to use those funds. First of all, it has to be agreed with the government that the funds come back to Scotland on the basis of usage. And then the funds have to find their way back down to the health boards so that the health boards can then fund the medicines that they've accepted through the system. Otherwise, there's no balance. So I think that's an absolutely key part. Otherwise, we'll have all these yeses and the health boards won't be able to fund it. And I think it's important to note that the system is based on a quarterly assessment of spend. So every quarter, the money will come back. So that should also help the obvious cash flow aspect of it.
Mr. Kent.
Thank you. I just wanted very briefly to return to the point of patient access schemes, because I do think it is essential that the we are clear about the role that patients could and should play in such schemes. We mustn't put patients in the situation where they feel they're in a position where they're made to plead with industry for a lower price in order to get a drug that will work for them. So I do think we need to be careful about ensuring that patients can contribute on the value of the drug to their lives, but not, the price is not a matter for patients to have an input to. It's not appropriate for patients to be involved in those commercial decisions.
Anyone else? I want to put this on the table, but the ITPR system as it is now, because I think there is an issue that concerned committee members from the committee, and indeed at the debates, that there would be a recognition that people already in the system would have some consideration, while the transition was taking place, and accepting that the transition would take some time to get right, and it was important to get it right. And the committee received a letter yesterday from a statement and position from the Beatson cancer clinicians that are raising the issue of, despite the fact that the CMO wrote to Glasgow Health Board saying that the concept of exceptionality should not be a factor in any current IPTR under consideration. They are saying it's still very problematic, and they are contending that as far as Glasgow Clyde Health Board are concerned, it's business as usual. So we've got some of the patient groups here. Is that something that they reflect? And Joan Fletcher.
We've found difficulties with the same health board. We obviously welcomed all the transparency and the processes, the same processes throughout the boards, but we have found difficulties with that particular health board in what the process is now until the changes. They've checked one of the issues that they've got is which physician can actually submit an IPTA, and that has changed from when we first started the petitions to what the situation, or what Glasgow and Clyde are saying is now. So we have at present a patient that's stuck in the middle of this situation of being able to apply, or somebody to apply for an IPTA, and until the system changes in 2014. So we would ask, basically, is there any clarity on who can submit an IPTA? And is this going to be throughout all the 14 health boards, or will each health board have their own criteria on who can submit?
It would seem there's a bit of a communication breakdown. I mean, the Minister has made it clear to us in the debate, and indeed at the committee and privately, that this issue should be addressed. But, so it is a concern to receive that from the Beatson clinicians, that is still a problematic process. But we can maybe make representation as a committee to get clarity on it. Is there anyone else that has experienced that at this stage from the patient groups? No? Okay. Yeah.
Can I just perhaps declare a slight interest in this without getting into details? I think the particular case that Ms Fletcher refers to is a case that I've been involved in as well, and there's representations ongoing, and I'm sure we'd be happy to share with the committee as appropriate, but given the confidential nature of individual constituents, that's not something we can put in the public forum. But I wouldn't want to sit quietly during this particular discussion and not put that on the record.
Okay.
And we understand that the funding is there available for this patient to receive treatment. So
I think it is pretty important to us that while we're struggling, and working with the government to try and bring about a better system, and indeed with wider support for that objective, that there are people, and the recognition that people are stuck in the system for quite a long time now and missing out. So it is an important issue.
It's an important point as well. I think that somebody echoed over there is the timing of the medications because of the disease progression. You know, these patients can't wait very long times for these medicines, and I'm sure that reflects on a lot of not just the medicines, the treatment that we would require, but I think it reflects on a lot of different medicines around the table here.
Dennis Robertson, did I call you Dennis?
Thank you, Convener. It was actually just to go back on a couple of points. It was earlier on. I'm just wondering how the group actually came to the calculation that 1,500, would actually benefit from the decisions. And I wonder if maybe an explanation on cost effectiveness is required, because I'm not terribly sure if we're looking at best value or added value, or we're looking at decoupling added value from best value. And I'm just wondering if there's some clarity on those 2 points.
We may have a greater opportunity in the next panel to address those specific points about the numbers and indeed the costs associated and how they projected those numbers. But, I'm happy if, I don't think there's anybody in this panel can address that point at this, at this stage. Is there any other? I mean, we note that, and indeed from the written submissions, that there have been general, support for the proposals that's been coming along. But we have an opportunity this morning. I don't see any other committee member. Bob, you've got a question?
It's really just almost like a procedural question, Convener. As a committee, we've came together in this whole situation, and because I didn't see anyone else raising hands, if any advice you can give us, we'll decide how best to scrutinise this and follow through how this all implements. But how long do you think it would take to start to see a significant, so let's not put a target on it, a significant amount of new yeses coming through the system? What kind of timescale do you think is appropriate to see that? And how quickly should we move to scrutinise the success or otherwise of the new system?
I think from a patient perspective, the sooner the better. But I think it's important that we give the time to the detail to get it right from the outset. And I think our ability to do that is proportionate to the SMC getting the resources that they need to do this, because it's going to take time, people to recruit, to get in to do this stuff. So I think for me it's around getting the resources in place to make it possible, making sure that we discuss the detail, and make sure the system is robust as it can be and tested, so that patients genuinely benefit. And I guess we need to do that as soon as possible, because there's patients out there that may die in the next 6 months because we've not got this in place.
Anyone else? Professor Walters?
Just say, I think Gary makes an excellent point there. Time is crucial. There is, and I think we've discussed today, and there's broad acceptance, this is a very welcome initiative. There's a lot of detail still to be worked through. That's going to take time and effort, mainly by the SMC Secretariat. And I think that the crucial question, to my mind, the largest threat that underpins this whole endeavour is the provision of adequate funding to make sure that it runs smoothly.
I'm going to take our panel guest and then Aileen and then Richard. Mr. Samuel.
Yeah, just to add to that, as well as timescale, I think it's also extremely important that the changes are communicated effectively to patients and that they really understand the changes and how the new process is going to work. So as well as making it speedy, these changes coming in, I think understanding the public about how it's going to work is really vital.
So Fitt.
I would just add in that there's a degree of intent to look at any resubmissions, to prioritise resubmissions of medicines that were rejected perhaps in the last year or two. We'd like to think that that system would be given enough focus that any resubmissions are invited as quickly as possible, and then can be assessed as quickly as possible. So I'd add that in.
No other panel members? Aileen McLeod.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think some of the points I wanted to raise have already been answered in the last round. But it was around, I think there was a comment that was made by Lesley Loeliger about the need for the patient and clinician groups to have the financial support there to be able to help them to get to the required standing. So it was just to kind of ask the round table, you know, what kind of training and support do you think would be necessary? I mean, obviously we've got increased opportunities now for the patient and clinician groups to be able to engage with the process, and what other training and resources do you think that these groups will need to make sure that they are engaging and participating effectively with the process, given that some of the groups are quite small as well?
Ian, you haven't been in for a while, take you, and then Mr. Kent.
Just to deal with that last point that was made, one of the things that wasn't in the report was mention of expert centres for ultra-orphan diseases. In our experience, these are essential for effective treatment by concentrating expertise and making it available to clinicians throughout the country. Examples we have seen use encrypted communications so that orphan disease experts can offer advice, consultations, even diagnoses anywhere in the country. And where there may be a lack of clinical expertise in Scotland, or it's uneconomic to set up a centre for a handful of dispersed patients, or where one already exists in England, and we understand that reciprocal funding arrangements do exist in these circumstances, we think that the creation of these expert centres for ultra-orphan patients is absolutely essential. And coming on to the training point, when we were going through this process in England, we got terrific support from the NHS, who gave us access to a couple of consultants who helped us put together the patient voice. And we found this particularly useful in making the case that we had to make through the 3 evaluations that we've been through. So if there is one way that patient interest groups can be helped, it's along these lines. But they certainly, in some cases, will need a significant amount of help.
Mr. Kent.
Yes. In the English system, before AGNES, the Advisory Group for National Specialist Services, was abolished, the National Specialist Commissioning Team made arrangements for patient groups who wanted to have support to be supported by an independent advocate who was familiar with the system, who understood the criteria that were made available, on which decisions were made, and who could advise how to put a submission together for patient groups who lacked that capacity themselves. And I think having that independent expert help is incredibly valuable for patient groups who might otherwise struggle to understand how and what the committee mind works, as it were.
That covers, I would say, the patient aspect of what you were asking about there. If we then go back to the concept of an expert clinician that would be involved, it does now come back to having the correct expert clinician. And I know I always bring it back to my own condition, but that's the one I've got the experience of, and we do have a centre of excellence, which is fantastic. Having the right expert that knows all the cost offsets, all the things that patients would have to go through, all the costs that patients would have to go through if they didn't get on the drug, and they have a real understanding of exactly who the drug would work for, that's the person that has all that information already. So the training would come down to having an understanding of the documentation that would go with it. But if you've got the right person, the right expert, they have that detail there that is really needed to make the difference.
Anyone else? Richard?
Yes, I'm still slightly concerned about the relationship between the national approval system and the health boards. And I just wonder if people feel that we've sorted that, in that there were delays in terms of the length of time that it was taking for an individual health board to put in place the local approval of what had been approved nationally. So have we changed that sufficiently Because I think there are different, there are different circumstances for different drugs. For the generality of conditions that aren't requiring a national expert centre, then if they don't require that, then local approval obviously depends on the local clinicians who are engaged in the clinical process. But if there is a national centre, as in PNH, why do we need the individual health board then to approve it? Because you can get back to the circumstances where if one board approves it immediately and another one takes a few months, this could be really significant for that individual patient. And yet we've got one expert centre. So the same clinician is recommending that this patient is suitable for treatment. And then it depends which board they go into. So have we got that bit right?
Anyone want to take that?
Does silence mean yes, we have? Or does silence mean no, we haven't?
Mr. Lowe's going to take it. Thank you.
I'm not sure it is fixed. I think part of the issue is the SMC guidance is not mandatory in Scotland, so nobody is obliged to implement it. And I think, for me, the best case scenario is that as soon as SMC guidance is available, it should go onto the formulary of every health board in Scotland, and we should leave it up to clinicians to decide when and how they want to prescribe these drugs in clinical practice. So we can't mandate to doctors that they must do what SMC guidance says. It just needs to get on that formulary as quickly as possible and leave it up to clinical judgment with the funding in place to make it available.
I suppose that's me harping back to this letter from the clinicians at the Beatson. How do we, it's a question for the next panel, so how do we create a situation that we don't have that, the standoff, despite the intervention of the Chief Medical Officer, an expectation is that it should be easier, whatever. The clinicians are saying that it's still problematic. They can't, so how do we avoid that in the future? That's the whole, the whole point of the inquiry. And yes, Lesley.
My situation, we have one single Scottish expert for my condition. So my hope for all of this had always been exactly what you have said, which is that we would have the one decision made basically for the whole of the country for ultra-orphan conditions. I know that for other conditions there will be experts dotted around potentially. So that had always been my hope, because I've sat in my patient group with one patient who's on her knees and one patient who was racing back to go to work, and she said, "Why are you well and I'm not?" And he said, "I'm not in your health board." That was it. So that's the thing that I have. My utopia was to get the single decision for the country.
Mr. Lowe, you want to come back?
So I think it's important to understand where the IPTR process is used. It's typically used when SMC has said no. And I think we've discussed in the committees before, it's not fit for purpose. It's not the system to adjudicate in this situation. This idea that we should be demonstrating exceptionality in these clinical situations is prehistoric. It's not good. So I think that system needs to change in the future, even when we do get SMC no's. And I think that the whole thing around, Dr. Simpson is going to mention, is the funding going to be available to health boards? But it should be, because these treatments are coming to market anyway, independently of whether SMC are in place or not. What SMC does a robust appraisal to make sure that these drugs are clinically and cost-effective and represent a good use of NHS resources. If we take that away, they're still coming, and health boards need to budget for them anyway. So we need to make sure the funding is in place. It should be in place anyway, so that we get fair and equal access to the best possible treatments for patients, as driven by a discussion between the clinician and the patient as to what is the best option. So we just need to join the dots a little bit. The funding needs to be in place. We need a robust system to approve these medicines. They need to be put on the formulary as quickly as possible, then leave it up to the clinicians and the patients to make these drugs available to the right patients at the right time in the right way.
Professor Walters and then Dr. Macdonald, and I think Richard back. Yes.
Yeah.
Fletcher as well.
I don't think you find a clinician in this country who would disagree with what Eric's just said. It comes back to the original point. It's that the time frame is crucial, particularly for some of these conditions, and the idea to streamline that process from the yes from SMC through to the pharmacist handing the tablets to the patient. However we can achieve the minimisation of the time it takes to do that, the better.
Joan Fletcher.
I want to come back to what Lesley was saying, really, and it's on the issues of who are going to be the clinical experts. And I think it also, we can recognise that there really aren't that many clinical experts in Scotland with the particular knowledge of the disease that I deal with. But what we would say, again, with funding, that you're asking about funding, we would welcome to have the experts up in Scotland. We really would. It would save patients travelling down to England who, find it difficult to travel, and we would welcome the experts in Scotland. But we do feel as though there needs to be some kind of funding and some kind of bridging in between getting those experts within Scotland or with help from clinicians from other countries in the UK. Because I think this is what happened with your particular Centre of Excellence that you've now achieved in Scotland, isn't it, Lesley? That it was clinicians from outside that came in to educate these willing clinicians up to a standard of where they become the experts. And we would also say, we would question who is going to be the experts on the, I know we welcome the fact that they've said that the IPTRs are not fit for purpose and that it's going to change, but who are going to be the experts that's going to be involved in the new process?
Dr Macdonald and then Richard Simpson. Oh, they'll take you in, Mr Kent.
Just a related point in terms of how is it working at the health board, so building on the previous comments. I think also the comment that we hear from a lot of companies, and I think it was in some of the submissions related to today's meeting, is the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund, the process there and how to access that money, what the guidance is. I don't think the guidance exists, who to submit what to. I think that's also very unknown and very unclear. So again, that's fairly inefficient if agencies are trying to, or physicians or patient groups are trying to access that fund of money.
Mr Kent.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me that the nub of the problem is who's making decisions. I mean, we're talking about the National Health Service, and the founding purpose of the National Health Service was to respond to patient needs. And in this situation, we have a potential, an effective drug which will benefit the patient in the opinion of an expert clinician, which has been approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and the accountants are saying no. I think that's the wrong person to be making this, or the wrong profession to be making this kind of decision.
Richard Simpson.
It seems to me that there are different horses for different courses, as it were. That if the condition is a rare one, or ultra rare, or indeed where there's just one centre or maybe two centres in Scotland, that having 14 health boards make this decision is inappropriate. That in those circumstances, the SMC's decision should be immediately followed by it going on the formulary, as Eric has said. For conditions which are treated in, for example, the 3 cancer centres, or are treated by individual health boards on other drugs, that it may be that the individual health board has to work out the clinical pathway in those circumstances. So it seems to me there's a bit of refining needs to be going on there. I have to say I remain concerned about 2 things. One is the IPTR, which I do not think is fit for purpose. I still think it should be a national system and not a local system, particularly for conditions which are rarer, where there isn't the expertise. And the other concern I have is a more global one, and that is, I don't think, although this process has been a really excellent one, as we've heard this morning, and does take us, I think, to a much better place, I think that we need to recognise as a committee and the government that the pace of change in terms of medicines is now going to be even more rapid, that we're entering an era of personalised medicine and genetic medicine, and this is going to create far greater strains than we have actually seen to date, and heaven knows we've had difficulty in coping with those. And I just want to put on the record and a caveat that I think this is not a process which has ended. We will have to, as a committee, continue to follow this up and recognise that the pace of change is actually going to get greater, and therefore the ability to match what will be increasing demands for expenditure in this area will be very difficult.
Richard Leigh wants to ask a question.
Yes, Convener. As I say, most of the questions have been asked, and I thought I wouldn't need to come in, but the point that Dr Richard Simpson made just there is quite relevant, and also I think it leads on to the question of resubmissions. The TNF report noted over the last 2 years there were around over 60 not recommended medicines, indications that may fit the definitions of end-of-life, orphan or ultra-orphan, and they may be appropriate for review under the new process. Does the panel believe, both from the pharmaceutical side and from the patient side, that the industry is likely to engage with the new process by presenting resubmissions for the end-of-life orphan, ultra-orphan medicines previously not recommended for use by the SMC?
Mr Fitt.
Do I think the pharma industry would re-engage and resubmit? Absolutely. If they've got a rejection, say in the last year or two, and the parameters have changed, and it makes it more likely that the medicine might get approved, then I think I would expect them to resubmit, and I would encourage them to resubmit. And I'm thinking that in mind of a couple of breast cancer drugs from last year. So, yes, I would expect that to be the case.
Anyone else?
I am not necessarily quite so sure, because obviously drug companies have been very hesitant to resubmit or submit in the past because of the cost of, like, the financial model, for example, and they expect to get the not recommended. Things have changed. My request would be that the SMC communicates very clearly to the drug companies how the new system, with details, how the new system is going to operate and how they will be able to look at the overall impact of the drug rather than just quite so heavily on the cost. If it's very well communicated, I have high hopes.
No?
Yes, I mean, I obviously can't comment for every company, but I would expect there will certainly be some resubmissions. I think many companies are looking at the devil in the detail once again to see exactly how it's going to work. And for some, it'll be an easier decision than others. But I think, as long as we continue to work together with the SMC and get the processes there and communicate them, then they'll have a little bit more certainty as to what they're stepping into. But clearly, a huge amount of effort has gone into revising a system so that there can be more yeses. So I'm sure there will be some resubmissions, but I think every company has to make the decision sort of based on what they're offering to the NHS and how they see the detail working.
I don't have any other questions at this point, but I realise if there are areas that haven't been covered that you wish to place on the record, now's your opportunity. Is there anyone wishing to make any comment? We covered the areas as you saw them. Yes, Dr Macdonald.
I do know I said it before, but just to reiterate, I think the availability of funding at the health board so that they can pay for the drugs and the opportunity of using something like the PPRS payback is certainly an opportunity that wasn't originally in the design, but it just happens to be available at the same time as the SMC changes. So I do think getting that money to the health board.
Anyone else? Then can I thank you once again for your attendance, participation, and the evidence that you've given us throughout this whole process, and indeed all the help you gave us in the inquiry. We look forward to working with you in the future to evaluate at an appropriate time, the outcomes of the new proposals. Thank you all very much indeed for your attendance this morning. Thank you. We suspend at this point and set up for the next panel. Thank you all. We now continue with agenda item number 1, which is, of course, accessing new medicines. And our second evidence session this morning is with the SMC. Can I welcome to the committee Professor David Webb, Chair of the Task and Finish Group. Thank you for being here. Professor Angela Timoney, Chair of the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and Professor Jonathan Fox, Chair-elect of the SMC, and Anne Leigh, Chief Pharmaceutical Advisor at the SMC. And I think, Professor Fox, we're going to have some introductory statement, aren't we? Or is it Professor Webb?
I thought as Chairman of the Task and Finish Group.
That's what I get for reading my brief today.
So I know you've heard a little from the previous group, but I thought it might be worth making a few background remarks and going through the process and the thinking behind the report. So I'm grateful to you, Chairman, for inviting us to speak to you today. First of all, I think it's important to remember that through SMC, Scotland has one of the fastest HTA systems in the world, and that SMC gets cost-effective drugs for common conditions to patients sooner than almost anywhere else in the world. And there's a lot of interest in what SMC does overseas. Lots of people come to Scotland to try and understand the system so as to implement it elsewhere. So we have a world-class system. Unlike NICE, SMC deals with all new drugs, all new indications for existing drugs, all new formulations. So it's a comprehensive process. And that's only possible because of submissions that are made by the pharmaceutical industry. So it's a work in association with pharma, and it's their efforts that help to make SMC cost-effective. Our proposals were based on an evolving process that would add value to the existing system, would improve access, but not interfere with the majority of the business with review of drugs for common conditions or more common conditions. If we move to the Task and Finish Group, we had all relevant stakeholders present, including clinicians, patient representatives, ABPI representatives, 3 of those, a very diverse group that I knew they were all coming with their own opinions, and not all maybe consistent opinions. We had a very tight deadline of 20th of December from the Cabinet Secretary to deliver a report, and I was delighted to see so many people willing to commit to 3 meetings in October, November and December. We had about 35 people at each meeting. Almost everyone came to 2 meetings, almost all came to 3 in fact. And all of the parties in the meeting fully recognised the cross-party will of Scottish Government to improve access for medicines at the end of life and for rare diseases. What I think was interesting was, whilst I was rather worried about a risk of entrenched views and people walking out of the meetings, it was, as you've heard earlier, a very constructive discussion. It was a very open discussion. We started with a relatively blank sheet, a range of options. We explored options, we eliminated options, we added in new options, and it was a very open discussion to reach the report that was sent to Cabinet Secretary on the 20th of December. The way we dealt with the recommendations was in 2 parts. So if we first of all start with the major part, which was end of life and rare conditions, and as you've heard, we're calling that orphan conditions affecting less than 1 in 2,000 people. That's about 2,500 people or so in Scotland. When we looked at what we'd seen at SMC over the last few years, it was clear that most of those rare conditions were also end-of-life conditions. Many of them were cancers. And we felt we could deal with end-of-life and rare conditions together under one review process. And we used as end-of-life, our definition was an expectation of death within 3 years from the condition. That is perhaps slightly broader than one of the definitions used by NICE in a previous incarnation, but we thought this was fair and inclusive. We started by looking at a QALY weighting. Usually the upper limit is around £20,000 per QALY that NICE and SMC accept. We looked at multiples, and we tried twofold, taking it up to 40,000, 60,000, 80,000. We had to get to about 80,000 before we would include most drugs as a yes. And by the time we'd sort of done this playing around, it just felt terribly arbitrary and not an appropriate way to go forward. So we eliminated that and decided instead to use the existing modifiers alongside an entirely new process called the PACE, the Patient and Clinician Engagement. We've always used experts to tell us about the condition, but we haven't actually asked their views on the new drug. So this will get them in the room, talking with patients, talking with SMC members about the value this new drug will bring to this group of patients. So it's very different from what exists at the moment. In establishing a PACE meeting, which would be on the wish of the submitting company, we would then seek greater clarity on the potential role of the medicine, with the idea of gaining greater clarity for a case for acceptance. So we'd look at criteria for treatment relevant to current therapies. We'd look at which patients might be expected to benefit most from the medicine. We'd look at continuation rules. How long would you try with this medicine? And we'd try to get further outcomes. We'd like there to be a process for looking at long-term outcomes with these new drugs. A key output from the PACE meeting would be really more clarity on the patients' and clinicians' views. Value that's not really captured by the QALY. And we'd be interested in disease severity, level of unmet need, and the impact on carers. So it's a much broader assessment than has been undertaken in the past. And implicitly, although until we have the system in place, it will not be clear, absolutely clear what will happen, we very much expect that this will substantially increase access to these new medicines. We think that the use of the PACE process would substantially reduce the need for what were IPTRs and will be the PACS system, because the IPTRs are there for clinicians and patients who feel that they're unable to use a drug that both think is of value. Here, the patients and the physicians will be there in the process, so we hope there'll be less need for that sort of process to follow on. We'd also be able to use the existing IPTR system to see which drugs, which SMC have not recommended in the past, might be those that are most heavily wanted by the Scottish population, and use that as a way to prioritise which resubmissions will be looked at if there are a very large number come in early on. We then dealt, the second part of what we looked at was the very rare conditions. That's the ultra-orphans affecting less than 1 in 50,000 people. So that will be 100 patients or fewer in Scotland. So these really are very rare conditions. Here, small studies with simpler data are usually the case than for the other drugs we're talking about. We examined a range of options. We still would like to see a cost per QALY, but we did not think cost per QALY should be the focus of the discussion here. What we wanted was a framework of explicit criteria that would help us come to a decision. So we would look at the nature of the condition, the impact of the medicine, the impact of that technology beyond the direct health benefits, the strength of the case, and value for money. And we'd also plan, where required, that we invoke a PACE if the company would like to do so. We'd still have that cost per QALY, but it really wouldn't be a key driver. Finally, moving to implementation, SMC, I know from having been involved in its work in the past, is an extremely busy organisation. They have done a lot of out-of-hours work over the last 3 to 4 months to build up this process with no new funding. I think what's crucial is that they're able to employ the new staff necessary to do this much greater body of work that will come through. And SMC have made the promise, funding, if funding available, that they would start this within 2 months. And that means that drugs would come through the process over the 4 or 5 months following. So decisions would come out in the second half of 2014. But it is contingent on new budget. This will come at a cost to the NHS in Scotland, and there was an estimate of the cost in the first year based on drugs we can see coming forward who would fit the bill and that we would then say yes to them. And that was somewhere just around or above 70 million. And that would allow an estimated 1,500 additional patients to receive treatment. If we look back at the resubmissions that have failed, and if they were also brought into the mix and they were successful, I think that was around another 1,500 patients, and with an additional pretty substantial cost, maybe of the same order, I'm not sure, as the 70 million I've already mentioned. So in summary, I and my colleagues on the Task and Finish Group and SMC all believe that these changes will deliver substantially improved access to medicines at the end of life and for rare conditions, intended as a bridge, I hope, eventually to a value-based approach, the Scottish model of value, which has been discussed in the past. I have no additional comments as a preamble. I don't know whether Angela might want to add to any of that.
Just very briefly, because I think this is the opportunity for the Health and Sport Committee to speak to SMC, but I suppose I was heartened by some of the comments that were made in the earlier session from the patient groups who both sat around our table and who have read our report about their positive comments, by the clinicians and the pharmaceutical industry, all of the stakeholders that we've worked hard to engage. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Webb for the work that he's done on behalf of SMC in taking this forward for us. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think we move quickly into questions. Rhoda Grant.
You talked about costs to SMC, you talked about costs to NHS boards. In the evidence we received earlier, there was also costs to patient interest groups who will be very much involved in this process. Some felt they were equipped to deal at the moment and could do that, but others were concerned that they needed support, training and indeed some help with the costs involved. Has that been factored into the costs that you mentioned in your opening statement?
I'm sure that is in the costs, but I think Angela might want to speak to what support SMC give to patients currently, but there is no new money in that area.
Yeah, so at the moment, SMC have a patient and public involvement group, and we have recruited under some new public involvement officers to try to support patients and patient interest groups in making submissions. We've worked very hard with them to kind of understand what the issues are for them and to make sure that they can contribute fully to our process. There's an issue for me about effectively the PACE mechanism to some extent doesn't really require the patient interest groups to understand the SMC decision making. That's not what we need from them. What we need from them is we need to understand what the issues are for them and their condition. And we want to hear that. So I think that gives them an opportunity to do it without having to understand the system in some detail. We have to reach out to them. If they have additional educational requirements, that's not been part of the resource that's been made available. And it may be something separate for the NHS to think about it as a whole.
So you feel that this should fall to the NHS to support patient interest groups rather than SMC, because they will need some help through the process. If you've got a large interest group, then obviously they can buy in that expertise. But if it's a small interest group that may be involved maybe in one of those sessions, they would surely need an awful lot more support to enable them to contribute and to put across the patient interest.
We've been very fortunate, actually. About 70% of our submissions, between 50 and 70% of our submissions have a patient interest group submission at this time, so that they have been able to contribute to the process. One of the speakers earlier talked about the importance of having a kind of specialist clinician perspective, and the PACE mechanism allows the clinician who might understand the disease to actually contribute to that process as well. So that kind of gives us a richer sense of that, and I think that will contribute to our decision making.
Yes. Yes, Ms Leigh.
Just to add, our patient and public involvement group have already been planning for how they're going to communicate the changes to the patient interest groups, and they'll be working with the new public involvement staff that Angela's already mentioned to do what they can to raise awareness and encourage submissions. And there always has been an effort made to help smaller charities and patient interest groups to understand the process, and you know, that will certainly continue.
Annette Millen.
A couple of questions really from the pharmaceutical industry point of view. I've got your briefing note received this morning on improving progress and improving access, and the timetable. Submissions received from companies in May onwards will be able to use the new process. What is the position about medicines that have currently been submitted but haven't actually received a decision as yet from SMC, who under the old system would be likely to receive a no, and under the new system may well be approved? What's the position there, particularly thinking in terms of disadvantaging patients if decisions are put off too long?
There are lots of questions in there, really. I mean, first of all, we all need to come away from this meeting clear that we have the support of Scottish Government and able to get the funding to employ the staff, appoint the people and train them up. That will be an additional burden on SMC before they're relieved by those additional staff helping with the process. So whilst I'm sure SMC would like to start tomorrow, it's just realistically not possible. So that's why the May start. And we have to have consistent processes that won't be challenged. And so they need to be right before we start. And I think May is a pretty ambitious start date. Those that are already in the process, I think it's difficult. That we have the old process, we will have the new process. There may be companies who are waiting to see when the new process starts, holding up a submission in order to put it through the new process. I'm not aware of that, but that's quite possible. And I think if a company goes through the process in the old system and they feel that they would have been better advantaged by the new system, SMC has never been a group that is not willing to look at resubmissions. Unlike NICE, that gives a one-off shot, NICE encourages, SMC encourages new submissions when new evidence has become available, and I guess when the new system's in place.
Okay. The other question is, I understand that the Minister has said that he expects these submissions to be dealt with expeditiously, and that he pointed to £1 million of extra funding to allow this to actually happen, and to cope with the additional requirements the new process will bring. The report doesn't refer to this clearly. So how do you plan to cope with the demand of the extra workload, plus likely resubmissions previously declined? You know, the 60 odd or however many it is. I mean, will that promised funding cover? I don't think the funding's been approved yet. I don't think SMC have seen the funding yet, but I think it's probably. This is just. But I think Angela probably needs to answer that one.
You're absolutely right. SMC have been asked to continue with our current work programme. So we're still full speed ahead with all of the other medicines that we're looking at. And I'm meeting next week, and we have lots of medicines to consider. In addition to that, we've been asked to develop a new methodology for these particular groups, which we have developed. And we now, as we agreed and you heard it earlier, we've got a lot of detail to work through with that. We've also been asked, and that will be for the new medicines coming through, and we've also then been asked to look at resubmissions. So there's quite a lot of work for SMC to do, and we actually need to have the staff in place and the resources to do that. But we're keen to do this. We want to produce medicines, we want to produce advice which is helpful for the NHS in Scotland. In terms of the resubmissions, our thoughts are that we will actually work with clinical groups and clinical networks for them to identify for us what they see as being priorities, what they need guidance on, and what they would. So we will work both with the pharmaceutical industry to encourage them to resubmit. But if we get lots of resubmissions, we'll be working with the cancer networks, with the Area Drug and Therapeutics Committee to say which are the ones that are causing you most problems. And it's through that process that we hope that we will actually do it in a way that meets the needs of patients. That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
We'll pick up on that then and focus on that. On when the report was produced and made clear that you wanted to do this work, which was going to take a couple of months to set up or 5 months to have an impact. Did you outline what you believed that you needed to team up for that, tool up for that, or resource that? What was the bid to government?
So effectively, the Cabinet Secretary made an announcement asking us to undertake this work in October and asking us to do the rapid review by the 20th of December. And at that same time, he made the statement about £1 million per annum being available for SMC. And we were asked to prepare a business case to describe that. And we submitted that business case on the 20th of December, on the same day that we submitted the report.
What response have you had back from the government?
We're still in discussion with the government around receipt of resources, and we are making progress on that. We are meeting with them, the Scottish Government, tomorrow. So far, we haven't received any money, and we need to get it to do it. It takes time to employ staff. These are highly specialised posts. These are highly challenging positions, and in order for us to do it, we need to be in a position to do that. Healthcare Improvement Scotland have worked with us, and we've had a number of temporary positions and dealt with some of the additional resources around that. But in terms of permanent positions and recruiting the staff to do this work, we need to have the budget in place to do that.
What has been the barriers? What's the problem been in terms of your bid and how the Health Department view your bid or the government view your bid?
I'm not sure that I can answer that in any detail, to be perfectly honest. I think there's been some issues around. I think we've tried to kind of, when we put in our bid in the budget, we timed it over a period of time to say this is what we think we could do in order to recruit staff and to grow the team appropriately. I think they probably would like everything done yesterday, but nevertheless the resources are not in place. And also I think it's challenging for Scottish Government in terms of the resources that they have available to them. I'm hopeful that we'll have a good discussion tomorrow, and I'm happy after that meeting to write back to this committee and to confirm if we have had receipt of those resources, and then we can proceed.
The announcement of £1 million, does that reflect in an accurate way what you believe you need to do this job, or was your bid larger than the £1 million that was announced?
I actually think it's going to cost far more than £1 million to do this, but we are a cost-efficient organisation, and so basically we put in our bid for about £1.1 million, something like that. Basically, we tried to, in a sense, cut the cloth to fit the resources that were available, and we've tried to make sure that the things that we've developed will fit within that envelope. And that's been the challenge for all of us. But actually, I think we have a responsibility as an organisation that assesses cost-effectiveness of medicines to be cost-effective in our work as well. But it will be challenging, and let's not underestimate that this is an enormous piece of work that SMC have been asked to undertake.
What was your estimation of the price tag that you needed to do that job efficiently, quickly and properly?
We haven't done an official estimate of that. But my own personal estimate was that it was substantially more than that. But we can live with the resources that we've been promised.
Double, or 2 million, or 1.5 million, or 3 million. What's closest?
I think it's more like 2 million.
The impact of this, given that we're dealing with end-of-life conditions and rare conditions which are progressive. Is your time frame now on delivery slipping back because you haven't been able to confirm the funds that you need to recruit and properly resource the organisation?
We do not wish that time frame to delay. So if we get the resources as agreed, we will proceed as we said this morning.
But has it slipped in terms of your original estimate?
It hasn't slipped yet.
It hasn't slipped yet. So when is the drop dead date then before it starts the impact on?
We said end of February. We needed to know.
By the end of February. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Richard.
Just supplementary on that, just to put on record, and Professor Timoney has already suggested it. In fact, the SMC system compared to other systems is incredibly cost-effective. I mean, we frankly have had a bargain for years. At least I believe we have, but I would invite Professor Timoney just to give us some international comparisons, not in terms of absolute costs, but just an idea of that, because that's one thing. And the second thing is, a lot of other countries actually do follow us. I believe New Zealand, Australia, a few others. Is there a potential for us to say, look, we're gearing up with this new system. If you want to follow it, we would like you to actually make some contribution to this instead of simply picking up our results. In other words, we won't make available our background papers and our workings to you. I know that'll be difficult because you want to be transparent, but is there some way we could actually encourage these other governments who are piggybacking on our excellent work to make some contribution to the additional costs?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for recognising SMC's position in the past, Dr. Simpson, and I appreciate that. We are a remarkably cost-effective organisation. And so for comparison, we have been told that effectively we make decisions on about 80 medicines per year. And in terms of the cost that we are to the NHS, that's about £12,500 per piece of guidance that we issue. It has been suggested to us, and it's not an official figure, so I need to caveat in that way, that for NICE to produce an STA, a single technology appraisal, costs £160,000 per piece of advice, and for a multiple technology appraisal costs £250,000 per piece of advice. So these are simply an order of magnitude, more than 10 times as much as SMC costs the NHS. I'm not suggesting in any way that SMC should have that. We believe we should work effectively. In terms of charging out with the NHS, that would be an interesting proposal, and I would encourage, if you wish the Scottish Government to do that, they can. But we have tended to work actually across international boundaries with our colleagues to take things forward, and we have learned from them and they will learn from us, and all of that I think will help NHS and Scotland to take things forward.
Thank you. Bob Doris.
Yeah. Just kind of briefly, I know my colleague Emlyn was responding to some of the issues raised by the pharmaceutical sector. We heard from Dr. Francis Macdonald on behalf of ABPI today in relation to the new PPRS that's in place, which, if I took the notes correctly, is the overall branded medicine bill for the next 2 years should be at 0% increased costs. And of course that reflects branded medicines coming off patent. In other words, there's still a lot of cost increases within the system. It's not as simple to say 0% over the next 2 years. There will be cost increases in the system. And I think for the following 3 years, 2% per annum in relation to that. Dr. Macdonald was asking about what would happen in terms of if that ceiling was to be breached because of more yeses in the system, I suppose is the best way of putting it, and how that money would find its way back from a UK level to a Scottish level and ultimately into health board budgets. Have you, and I know previously when evidence has been given to this committee from SMC, the discussions that SMC were privy to was very limited indeed in relation to that whole renegotiation of the UK pricing systems. Has there been any discussions at a UK level to yourselves or indeed the Scottish Government, if you're privy to that, in relation to what would happen if that 0% ceiling was breached the next 2 years? Would money come back to Scotland?
This is really not for SMC. I understand there will be discussions, ongoing discussions between Scottish Government and DH, SGHD and DH around how that's to happen. And I'm aware that there is a working group at Scottish Government looking at then what happens with PPRS in terms of what goes down to the health boards, but really that's a Scottish Government issue.
Okay, can I do a follow-up on that then? Because there is, well, two reasons for asking it. One was because it was raised with us in the last session. It's appropriate to raise that question with yourself here, but also in relation to additional costs that this will put on the Scottish NHS, which I know that the political will to ensure are met, is just in relation to any financial modelling work that the SMC has done. Maybe put some of that on the record. What do you see additional costs to look like, and how will that compare to overall drugs budget costs, where there are significant medicines coming off brand, which will therefore become dramatically cheaper? So there's a kind of to and fro of the costs. I mean, has the SMC done modelling work on this, or would that be the responsibility of government? What would that look like?
Someone from SMC is sitting on the Short Life Working Group and is talking about the figures that we've discussed here in terms of the additional costs for the new methodologies, and that would be our contribution to that. In terms of benefits to the NHS with medicines going off patent, you should be aware that actually the increase in costs in medicines is due to increase in volume. We've got a change in demographics. We've got lots of older people. Those older people get more medicines, and most of that cost is already absorbed by the increase in volume rather than actually any price changes. That would be the work of this short life working group, I would think, to look at some of those issues.
Dennis Robertson asked a specific question in this earlier. You know, that maybe couldn't be answered, Dennis. You wanted to put that question again in terms of the workings behind the overall figures that have been put?
Thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, basically it's really just to try and understand the formula that was used in calculating the benefit to the patients. And I think it's estimated that 1,500 patients would benefit. And I just wonder how you actually came to that sort of particular number. And the other thing I was interested in, because it's been mentioned here too, is the cost efficiency. It's a very generic term for me. And I'm just wondering if we're looking at best value or added value, or have you decoupled the added value from best value? And it's really around those areas that I probably like a bit more detail, to be honest.
I can certainly take the second one of those, which is the cost efficiency issue. I mean, it's a normal arrangement to use the cost per quality gained as a way of judging a whole range of different technologies. It's easy using drugs to do that. We have a lot of information to help us generate that cost per quality. And the approach taken by the economists is what's called a utilitarian approach, which is trying to get the greatest value for the greatest number. And so whenever we spend on a high cost per quality drug, if the budget doesn't change, then we lose out on better value medicines. So the risk here is if we spend on very low value, high cost medicines, and it's the value that matters here, lower value medicines that you have to pay more for to get an extra year, then we will lose out. So there needs to be added budget going to the health boards to cover these new drugs. It was the will of the Scottish Government that this group of disadvantaged patients gain greater access to medicines, and there is no problem with that, but it's not done with the idea of improving overall cost efficiency. It slightly reduces overall cost efficiency. And if the first question was about the 1,500, that was just based on looking at SMC has done sort of forecasting work on new drugs coming through over a number of years now, has a formal report each year. If you look at the forecasted drugs and you look at the ones that would fit this bill of end-of-life, rare conditions, it was saying that all those get a yes compared with how many would have got a yes in the old system. So that's the 1,500 patients and the £70 million.
Would you estimate that obviously with the new system going to place that number might increase in the years to come? I mean, 1,500 was the estimate for the first year.
As new drugs keep coming through, those costs will amplify until those drugs in some years come off patent and then become cheaper to us. So there is always the long-term advantage of approving drugs and using drugs is that eventually they become cheaper. But yes, the costs will go up, and the costs will go up further if resubmissions come back to SMC, which, as we heard from our ABPI member, that is a likelihood. But they'll probably be spread over a longer period.
Yeah, thank you.
Bill Patterson and Richard Simpson.
Thanks very much. It's a different question. Is that all right?
Mine was supplementary.
If yours is something, that's fine.
Yeah, it's just to be quite clear, from Professor Webb, from what you said earlier, 1,500 is the forecast for new medicines coming through with the changed system. But did I hear you correctly in saying that the possibility of resubmissions would add a further 1,500? Therefore, the total cost to the health boards going forward could be £140 million, 70 million for each. Just to be quite clear, that's a very big sum.
Angela is reminding me that we probably thought 50 million for the resubmissions.
So it's we're talking about 120 million, which is roughly 10% of the current budget. So 10% additional funding, which will be a real challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Have there been detailed discussions since we last met in private or whenever with the Scottish Government about the detail of the thinking behind your proposals about the numbers and indeed the level of funding that the NHS would require.
That's the government short life working group that Angela's already mentioned, and we do have one of our team contributing to that work. And we've been asked to look in a bit more detail at the figures that are in the report that Professor Webb's just alluded to. And we do know there is uncertainty around these estimates. They are estimates. Some of the medicines might not come to market. We are making predictions about what their list price to the service will be, and so those estimates don't take into account any patient access schemes, any discounts that might come forward. So the usual caveats around these estimates based on a very uncertain pipeline all need to be factored in. But we are trying to help where we can in giving further advice on how the figures have been derived.
Yes, Professor Webb.
Just a brief supplementary. I think because of all these uncertainties, it will be very important to go back in a year, 18 months' time and look at how this has all operated, what new drugs have come through at what cost, and explore the utility of what we've done.
I'm just trying, because as far as I know, the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary have welcomed the report. I didn't know any caveats in terms of, well, we welcome the report, but we don't welcome that bit, or we question that bit. And I'm just, what type of detailed discussion is taking place between yourself, Professor Webb, and the team with the Cabinet Secretary on this, on your report?
The only meeting was the meeting that you and I had with the Cabinet Secretary.
Which was all of 10 minutes?
Yes.
And he hasn't... Well, for us, but I think they left quite shortly after it, shortly after we left.
Yes.
So...
I'm not aware of any detailed discussion.
There's been no detailed discussion with the Scottish Government on this. See, I just feel it's important, given all of the expectation this morning round about the table, about the political direction, the commitment. And I'm just concerned now, the more I hear about, if there's a difficulty securing £1 or £2 million to actually get the work done, then what sort of problem are we going to get £140 million out of the system if it's there?
So I think that was why we were a little bit anxious about adding new patient support when that question was asked. It wasn't, I think, that we wouldn't do it if there was money, but of course it's important to have the money, and so the anxieties are around that area.
Richard?
I think we really need to get, the government is going to have to get a handle on this. If it's 120 million, that's 10% of the drug budget. But you can take off maybe the Rare Diseases Fund, because with the new system that should be okay. And maybe, but that may be politically difficult. And it also means presumably the IPTR should drop. So some of the IPTR funding currently could come out of it. So the net amount may not be 120 million, it may be less. But we really need to, I think as a committee, to understand where we're going and to be supportive of the government, because I think it's going to be a real challenge. We need to get some figures on that clarified.
Do you have any figures? Because you did mention earlier that to deliver this, as well as getting funding for your resource, which is nothing in the scheme of things, it would seem, but the health service would need to be funded. If you put a figure on what, to answer some of Richard's questions, if you put a figure of what would need to get into the health service to fund this for that year or 18 months?
It is and would be speculation. And I think the figures that were in our report are probably as good as we can do without some pretty complex work, which will also still have lots of caveats around it.
So that work that Richard described about balancing the benefits, which would reduce some of the costs, as well what would need to be. That detail's not been carried out yet, no?
I think that is what this working group at Scottish Government is about, and we need to see the output from that group, I think. I think that's what they're trying to do. We've talked about the SMC part of it, but as you can tell, that is just one little part of it, actually.
When is that due to report that out?
I don't know.
We don't know when that's due to report either. Bob?
Just specifically on this, I like to try, I think Richard Simpson makes some very reasonable points, but I'd like to try and split it into two aspects. We're talking about £1 to £2 million. We'll see what happens. You're meeting the Cabinet Secretary in relation to funding the process side of things, so making sure the mechanisms are in place and you're planning towards that. And I think we have to separate that from national Scottish Government budgets to health boards and how that flows. Those are two very separate things. The political commitments there, so year-in-year budgets and budget amendments are made in this place as a matter of course. What we'll need to see at a later date is that short-life working group, how that impacts on budgets and subsequent budget amendments, but the political will is there. So none of that concerns me personally, Convener. What's important for myself is that the process that will then drive these funding liabilities or opportunities, depending how you look at it, to make sure that's not been compromised, because that's the key thing for myself in the scrutiny at this committee just now. So just for clarity, we have to assume the money is there, and we will scrutinise as a committee because the political commitment has been made and there has been a budget, and there's always in-year budget amendments, and there's a short-life working group looking specifically at this, so we have to assume the assumptions that come out from that will be identified into NHS budgets. But back to that £1 to £2 million, we'll see what happens with your Cabinet Secretary's meeting tomorrow, I think you said. Are we on course to deliver, I'm not talking about the funding of individual drugs, are we on course to deliver the more yeses as outlined in this report and accepted by the Scottish Government? Has that been compromised, or are we on target to achieve that?
Earlier, and I have to say it again, if we get the resources by the end of this month, we will proceed according to the timelines described.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Sorry.
Can I just say, I'm not at the meeting.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not at the meeting tomorrow, but we're not meeting the Cabinet Secretary tomorrow. I'm doing a clinic, but it's meeting the Scottish Government tomorrow.
Scottish
just
Government.
For accuracy.
Thanks.
Right. Rhoda.
In that, I understand what Bob's saying about your process, but going back to the 140 million, if your process works according to time and you start saying more yeses in 2 months' time, when does the cost of that start to impact on NHS board budgets?
The timelines that we have described, basically, it will probably be in September, October, probably October by the time some of these new medicines will be coming through in the system. So effectively, it starts to hit boards Q3.
But it undoubtedly would be incremental,
Absolutely.
a few coming through each month, so it will build up over a year.
Sorry, just on that answer, you're saying it'll build up. So is 70 million or the 140, depending on how many come through, going to be the cost on an annual basis going forward once the backlog has been cleared? Or is that the cost of where we think it'll peak?
The cost, I think it would build to, we predict it would build to at the end of the first year of full, or maybe second year of full operation.
And that will continue year on year thereafter?
And then there will be other medicines that get licensed that will also be, that will come through the process. So this describes the medicines that we expect to come through in the first year of the process working. There will be more medicines and different decisions following that. So there will be a background of those medicines and the new ones on top.
So it is complicated, though, because there will be some medicines that, for which we think we're going to be seeing in 6 months' time, for which there'll be safety issues and they won't get to market. There'll be some that will decide not to submit to SMC. There will be some that come through with patient access schemes where the cost we'd thought was going to be very high will be substantially lower. So these are all uncertainties that we really, we can't give an absolutely straight answer. It's not we don't want to, we just don't know.
I suppose that the next, has there been any interaction with the boards, if there's any feedback, we've had positive feedback from around the table here with those who have engaged in the process, etc. The boards will eventually have to face this problem, funded or not, and hopefully funded. What has their reaction been to your report?
Chief executives were involved in the task and finish group, and it was their very clear recommendation that we put the financials, the estimated financials, in the report. That was we weren't sure whether we should do that, but they were very clear we should.
Understand. So you have. So they had their say. They don't, that they were part of these recommendations and insisted that the funding issue should be put in there.
I believe that they would be, if they felt that the funding would flow with the decisions, they would be happy with the outcome.
Nanette.
Question about predictability and transparency under the new system. I mean, I think there was an acceptance that maybe the old process was lacking in some degree of transparency, and that not a clear understanding of how the SMC modifiers worked. Under the new system, with the quality having been deemed ruled out for the new system, there doesn't appear to be an actual indicator, like the quality. And so I just wondered how we ensure transparency for the public and some predictability for industry, and what sort of levels of cost effectiveness do you expect would sort of accept and decline of submission, or is that worked out?
This is all. Sorry. There's a lot of detail still to be worked out. We were only given the go-ahead for this system on January the 31st, so that's, 3 weeks ago. So with that caveat, clearly we're going to try to make the criteria, the inputs into the system as orderly, as evidence-based as possible, and also the outputs from the system. So we are, we will be, once we have the resource, creating pro formas which give the kind of information, the kind of background you're talking about. The cost per quality isn't going to be entirely irrelevant here. We will be asking for companies to submit the cost per quality for the groups concerned, but also we'll be looking at all sorts of other factors, the wider, what NICE used to call, until they changed their technology, the sort of wider societal benefit, so benefits to carers, employment issue, all sorts of things could input to that. And clearly, you're quite right, we do need to make this as explicit, as transparent, and as understandable as possible, and we're going to try to do that. But that's probably the best answer I can give you at the moment. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just add to that obviously the new processes around the pace are just one of the other recommendations from your committee that we're implementing, and we will be meeting in public from May 2014, so that will support the transparency.
It was just just something on the record. We have had, and we appreciate the benefit of having meeting you at least a couple of times since the report. So, but on the record, I mean, it's just this. It seems a bit contradictory. The quality's in there, but it doesn't really matter. Is that something that holds in terms of? In terms of openness and everything else, people do, I think we felt from the last process, they want to understand at least how their case has been, the rules that's been applied, and how judgment has been made on their access to a given medicine. So it seems a bit of a contradiction, and I can't understand it anyway. The quality's in there, but it doesn't matter. Yes.
The quality does matter.
There we go.
So I'll be sitting at SMC, well I won't actually, Jonathan will be sitting at SMC, and we will be receiving the draft recommendation from NDC, which will be based on the company submission, which will be an assessment of the cost effectiveness of that product. If it's a minded no at that stage, we will then the company will have an opportunity to resubmit another pass to give us an improved discount. and that will come to SMC. So we'll have a number of pieces of information. We'll have the NDC draft recommendation. We'll have the feedback from the company that we currently get, perhaps correcting some of their assumptions or some of the factual errors, some of the sensitivities we've asked them to do. We'll have potentially a new patient access scheme. We'll have a patient interest submission. And we will have the view from the PACE group about where they really think that the patients and clinicians would really value having that medicine. And all of those factors, and particularly the patient and clinical engagement, the PACE mechanism, will be an important deciding factor in SMC coming to a judgment at that time around that medicine. But we have a responsibility, I think, to make sure that we actually have cost effectiveness and that we listen to patients and our stakeholders, and it's that balance and judgment that's important. And the result of which will be that effectively, at the moment I would say that the cost per quality is not the deciding factor for SMC, but it's a major factor. Now we've got some other factors that will help to actually inform our judgment in a significant way that responds to the needs of patients in Scotland and clinicians.
So the weighting's changed. It's a broader...
Yeah, it's a broader perspective. David?
We've often said in the past, if it was just about cost per quality, we would just leave the economists in the room and they could make the decision for us. It's always about clinical judgment. And we will just have more inputs to the clinical judgment in the future.
Richard Simpson.
Leads nicely on to my question, which is, for some conditions, there is a very limited expertise in terms of Scotland, sometimes even the UK. It's a very limited. So you're comfortable you're going to be able to get that expertise from wherever? That's the first part of it. And the second thing is, there is a growing body of criticism, which I think gives us a real conundrum, which is that clinicians who've been involved in the research that led to the drug being approved shouldn't then be approving the drug for use. Now, I don't agree with that, because I think, particularly in limited things, those who are experts are going to be the ones involved. So, you know, the limitation on the experts is being confounded by this. So I wonder if, I don't know how clear I'm making that, but it was actually came up originally with vaccines and the vaccine committee. You know, that there's been an attack on should people in the vaccine committee and the UK vaccine committee have almost all been involved. But can you find an expert that hasn't been involved? I don't think you can. So I think this, you know, would you like to comment on this area?
Yeah. Well, on the first point, we are prepared and intending to ask experts from as wide an area as necessary, certainly within the UK. I think even in most of the ultra-orphan medicines, we can find experts within the UK, and in some of them we can find experts right here in Scotland. So the answer is yes, we will be casting our net as widely as necessary. On the second point, conflict of interest or declaration of interest, I think, is the general issue. At SMC and at the New Drugs Committee, we have very strict rules about that, so that people with personal specific interests have to leave the room, and we declare other levels of interest too. However, I think in the task and finish groups we will have to relax some of these very tight rules, bearing in mind that they're not making the final decision, which will still be made by the SMC with its tight declaration or disclosure policies. So the answer is that people involved in the PACE mechanism are necessarily going to have a conflict of interest. The patient groups have, many of the experts will have, and that will not bar them from taking part, but it will be disclosed publicly.
Any other questions from committee members? Bob Doris?
Just briefly, apologies, Convener, if I'm now repeating something, because I had to leave the room for a short period of time. Concerns were raised in the last panel in relation to the transfer from the IPTR system over to the peer-approved clinical system, and the Chief Medical Officer and the Cabinet Secretaries made it clear that whilst there's that hiatus, whilst IPTRs continue until the new one's brought in, flexibility is hoped will be shown. Now, in my own health board, there's various views on whether or not the spirit of that flexibility is being used with IPTRs or otherwise. I don't have enough evidence in relation to that but I'm hoping to, in terms of an individual constituent, I put my interest clearly on the record there in the last session. Given these concerns, how quickly can we get this new system online? I think a bit of certainty in that process would certainly be helpful for the constituent that I'm representing, who might be kind of falling between two stools at the moment, and it would certainly be important. So any more information on that would be most welcome.
So the peer-approved clinical system is a Scottish Government system to replace IPTRs, and they've said that they're going to issue guidance on that in May, and I think we look forward to that guidance.
Okay. Can I ask then, that's Scottish Government guidance on that. What input would you have at all in relation to what that new guidance should be?
Involved at all. That's a separate system.
Right. Well, there's a gap in my knowledge, and I really shouldn't be using the evidence session to fill in the gap in my knowledge, I have to say. But just for clarity, what's your understanding? Who is it the government are speaking to in relation to bring online that criteria, that new criteria?
I honestly can't answer that, but what I can say is to repeat what Professor Webb has said. I mean, we have an expectation to some extent that if SMC's systems and processes are up and running, there will be some of those medicines that are currently not recommended and that go into the IPTR system will now not be going into the IPTR system because we have the PACE mechanism. So we hope we've helped with that part of it. But that separate issue is really out with the SMC's responsibility.
One thing that would be within your scope then, based on what you've said, is if there's a prioritisation which you'll give resubmissions, you were saying. So if it was an orphan condition and the medication is not an end-of-life situation, but it's an ultra-orphan condition, but not to give the medication could lead to a degenerative impact on the patient, would that be one of those that you would prioritise for speedy reconsideration?
I mean, that's a very strong case that you've put to us, and clearly that's the sort of decisions, the clinical factors that we would be taking into consideration, and we would be really listening very closely to the service about what are the particular challenges that are in the system for them that they would like us to put through as quickly as possible, and we would respond to that as well as we can. But it also depends on the company making that resubmission to us as well. We can't look at it if the company don't resubmit. So that there's that bit where we have to be encouraging the companies to make resubmissions, and we have to listen to the NHS in terms of where are the problems for you, particularly in the system. That's what we'll be trying to do.
All right, Convener, thank you. Just trying to represent my constituent without breaking confidentialities, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Richard, did you?
Just one final thing from me is that there is a fundamental difference between NICE and SMC. I mean, there are lots of differences, mostly very positive. But one fundamental difference is that when NICE approves the limited drugs that they consider, and it is far more limited than SMC, but once they are approved, health boards and, well, foundation trusts in England or whoever have to deliver. They don't have a choice in the matter. Whereas the SMC is an advisory group to the area drug and therapeutic committees. Are there circumstances in which either Professor Timoney or Professor Vox, as the incoming chair, feel the SMC should be able to say, look, you know, this is a medicine which we believe should be introduced now and immediately, and there should not be certainly any prolonged consideration. I raised it in the first session, thinking of orphan, ultra-orphan drugs, end-of-life drugs, where a rapid decision following the SMC decision is really imperative and no prolonged delay at that point. Any prolonged delay could seriously affect someone's end-of-life circumstances. So are there different categories of drugs that you would like the power to be able to say, these must be introduced, and these other ones, yes, there may be a period of time where the clinical pathway has to be carefully considered because there are many different clinicians involved?
Yeah, I'd like a bit more power. That'd be great. But I think actually already there is an expectation that Health Board, and as set out in that letter last year, that Health Boards should have the medicine or an equivalent treatment. Remember, not all, as we all know, not all these medicines are immediately life-saving. There are a lot of medicines for which there are good alternatives. And there's already an expectation that that will be the case. The question is, SMC doesn't have the power to mandate that. That it would not be something that we would immediately be seeking. We do see ourselves as advising, and we facilitate, we allow, we're permissive of these medicines getting onto formularies. But at the moment, health boards do still have that power. But there is an expectation that important medicines are made available within 90 days, I think it is. So that's where we are.
It's probably worth mentioning for those that are interested, which are the health boards, the area drug and therapeutics committees and clinicians, the narrative of the report from SMC gives a very clear idea of how important a new medicine is.
So that you feel that's probably sufficient. I mean, I'm thinking that the decision by the area drug and therapeutic committee sometimes depends on their definition of equivalence. And, you know, I think there is some evidence out there that this is another postcode lottery. That there's some areas, thinking of the new anticoagulant drugs, for example, the interpretation of equivalence is such that some patients are being deprived of new medicines which do have a significant advantage. And I just wonder if we've got that bit right. I'm just trying to anticipate the next set of problems this committee will have to face.
At the moment, I feel that we've got enough on our hands, frankly, and I don't mean to be deliberately evasive. There are some differences of opinion, as you might imagine, among how the issue of how strong the advice or the instruction from SMC should be. But it's a different debate, which I don't feel we've got the energy to engage in right at the moment.
I think my apologies to our witnesses when I asked this question as well. I think myself and Dr Simpson's a little bit like Groundhog Day, going back a few months, we had very similar discussions. Just for clarity, the expectation is any drug approved under the current process or a future process that's about to come online should be made available on the formulary within 3 months. But individual clinicians in every health board area have the power to prescribe that drug after an SMC approval. It's whether it's prescribed routinely or not routinely. If I remember, that was the issue that we experienced during our reporting of this issue. So that we have to be careful that individual clinical decision-making for individual patients is paramount in relation to this. But within 3 months, every drug approved by the SMC, whether formally on the formulary or not, although it should be, can still be requested and used by individual clinicians. Is that the situation, or did I get that wrong at the time?
So I think this is an important point. SMC will assess, we have, as I say, 80 pieces of guidance a year. Many of those pieces of guidance are around medicines for common medical conditions for which there are lots of therapeutic options. Our job is to say which of those products that have come to market from the pharmaceutical companies are cost effective. So it may be that for a particular therapeutic area there are 6 or 7 medicines which are all cost effective, and we've done that work for the boards in advance. And we say to them, and you may choose some of those medicines to put on your formulary, and you'll be able to get buying policies and to be able to secure those even more cost effectively for patients. So that's a formulary decision, and ADTCs have to do that for their boards to secure best value. But nevertheless, if SMC have said the product is cost effective, and if a clinician really thinks that product has some particular benefits for their patient, even if it's non-formulary, there will be a non-formulary request process within the boards, and they'll be able to access it. So you're right in your understanding of that. But I think we need to be clear, not everything that SMC says will go onto a formulary, and I wouldn't expect it to. Because I think actually that would crowd our formularies out and would actually it would inhibit clinicians in some of their decision-making. Part of our job is to give them guidance from a limited use of products, a limited range of products, to improve systematic use of medicines within that board.
Is there no other questions? Can I thank you all again for your attendance and the work that you've done, and all the best in the future to you, Professor Timoney, and of course to you, Professor Fox. We'll probably be seeing you in the future, there is no doubt, certainly. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I hope that makes it you have to announce the closing of the meeting because there's other agenda items.
That's we now close the meeting on that. We've got one other item that we're dealing with in private. move to agenda item number 2, which is our public petitions, and seek the committee's agreement that we defer the petitions that were on the agenda today until next week. Do I have the committee's agreement that we defer until next week? Thank you very much. That close the meeting on that. Thanks. Bye-bye.